I'm Ruth Barton and I'm presenting on behalf of Patrice, Jalette, who's sitting in the audience. And I assume we'll both take questions, Patrice. Okay, so the case I'm looking at, or the cases Patrice and I are looking at, are in Tasmania, and I've put here a map of Tasmania because it's often left off maps of Australia. So what we're looking at is the northwest coast, which is up this area up here, and that's home to about 100,000 people, which is about 20% of Tasmania's population. So not a very big place. So the main centres there are Devonport and Burnie. Burnie's got about 20,000 people. Devonport's got about 25,000. Alderstone's in between, which is a dormitory town, it's got about 15,000. And then we've got over here Smithton, which has got about 3,800 people. So the northwest coast is isolated and disadvantaged. It's got low levels of labour market participation. It's in fact one of the most disadvantaged places in Australia. It's got high levels of long-term unemployed and very low levels of educational attainment. Unfortunately, I, in coming from Burnie, am the exception rather than the rule by a long way. So Tasmania, well, the northwest coast of Tasmania has gone from being, I suppose, a reasonably prosperous working class to being one that is quite disadvantaged. And so we can see here, I've done a little bit of a timeline about the closure of industries and the jobs that went with them. So in the 1920s, Tasmania underwent a process of hydro-industrialisation. Out of that, government tried to encourage, through the use of tariffs and cheap electricity, industry to come to what was formerly a very agricultural area. So we can see here the types of industries that opened. APPM is Australia Pulp and Paper Processing. Australia Pulp and Paper Mills, they closed in 2010 at once. Their height had 2,500 jobs. So one of the cases we're looking at here is McCain and their vegetable processing. We had paint, pigmentation, weaving and manufacturing, and still and milk processing. So we can see a lot of jobs have gone from the area. So what actually remains? Well, we've still got dairy industry there, and that's long-standing, I think starting in about the 1890s. And we've also got vegetable processing and potato processing. So this started about the World War II as a government-run industries, and they were sold afterwards to private industry. And by the 1990s, Simplot Vegetable Processing was the largest frozen vegetable plant in the Southern Hemisphere. So Tasmania produces about 85% of Australia's frozen peas and 75% of its frozen beans. So if you have frozen peas or frozen beans, they're probably from Tasmania. Okay, so Simplot is, we can see here, a US company, and there's just something that talks about it. It basically does things like homemade meals and as well as obviously a whole lot of frozen things, frozen vegetables, and does a whole lot of things to supermarkets that you buy in the freezers. McCain is a Canadian company. Again, it does pretty much the same. It's got a plant in Smithton, so it's up the far end of the northwest coast as opposed to Simplot, which is in the middle, and again it does pretty much the same type of I suppose products as Simplot. So having looked at that, what does that, we've got these companies here, these multinational companies, and what they are is in a small and isolated place. So as a sort of, I suppose, poor and isolated place, Tasmania is especially vulnerable to the movements of capital. And again, indeed, I suppose, as we can see from a whole lot of those closures before, often though those multinational companies, the decisions to close them were made outside Tasmania and probably indeed Australia. So when, in a sense, the challenge then for workers is to try and move, I suppose, the locus of action to a place where they have far greater control. So somewhere where they have control over it and they can, I suppose, in a sense, cause disruption and this stability that the company craves, try and disrupt that as well. But of course, what they're doing this in the context of is an area affected by deindustrialisation. So what companies want, I suppose, is ongoing, stable relationships in the community and with their workforce, and what the unions are trying to do is to disrupt that relationship by making use of space and place. But of course it happens in a context where it's been done in an area that's deindustrialised, that's very anxious about jobs, and what we've seen there is that trade union militancy can be seen as a threat to jobs in the region, and that can create divisions between, I suppose, the union and the community. So what I suppose the bodies or the agents here, is in the employers and the unions, will try and do is to try and create local alliances that give them some form of stability. And in an area like the Northwest Coast, because of that context of deindustrialisation and isolation, sometimes what we see is quite contradictory alliances forming, and we'll see how they actually play out in these two cases. So we've got here McCain's, who are in Smithton. They have a plant that was built to run at a capacity of about 70 or 80,000 tonnes of potatoes. So what they do, I think, there is largely produce French fries, which they sell in the supermarkets or places like McDonald's. And what they've been doing is processing increasing numbers or tonnages of potatoes. So I think found figures that said that in 2012 they did 40 to 45,000 tonnes, and here we are less than 7 years later or so, and they are literally trying to do more than double that. But they've got some problems in doing this, because what they did in 2010, there was also a vegetable processing factory there at Smithton. They closed that down, and that created quite a lot of alienation amongst the local farmers. They'd invested in, had hopes of, obviously had their livelihood around growing vegetables for McCain, had invested in buying equipment, and all of a sudden that was disrupted. So what I think McCain hoped to do was that those farmers would then switch to growing potatoes, but they took quite an aggressive approach with them, as they had with their workforce, and said, we want you to grow potatoes and here's the price and you can take it or leave it. And the farmers said, we're going to leave it. So it meant that McCain's were having trouble sourcing their potatoes, and were in fact having to source them from as far away in Tasmanian terms as Scottsdale. And of course, the further away the potatoes are, of course, I suppose, the less they can, or increased costs. Though interestingly, what they've had is that they've got rid of the bloke from the mainland, and they've now replaced that person with a local born and bred Smithton person. So here we have in some ways the company making use of place and local relationships. So how do these local relationships play out? Well, McCain tries and does things with the community by sponsoring them, by handing local sporting clubs boxes of chips. But deep in the back of people's minds is the fact that they closed down the vegetable processing plant. So the union knows that, but as well in an area that's deindustrialised and is quite poor, these workers at the McCain's plant are seen as being paid quite well and having quite good wages and conditions. So there's this tension, I suppose, in the community about people not actually liking McCain's, but on the other hand, they're quite, in some ways, I suppose, resentful about the union. So what the union went out to try and do was to try and actually put forward their case, and they did things like publicising them by going around and getting local businesses to place flyers in their windows. So they got some cooperation from small business and I suppose this has formed a bit of an alliance with them. They've learned from the importance of media. The Simplot, as we'll see before, they've actually attacked the union quite aggressively in the press, and the union secretary went on the front foot and put forward the union's claims and talked about how McCain wanted to reduce pay and conditions and put forward the fact that what they wanted was fairness and equity. So McCain's were reluctant to engage, and they put this down for them being quite a private family-owned business. As well, what the union tried to do was build up solidarity between sites. Again, distance proved difficult for them, but in the community there were all these sort of local linkages that played out. So one of the fellows from the Swifton plant, he had his car serviced informally by someone who was a delegate, one of an activist at one of the other plants. So these sort of informal arrangements meant that there were linkages between parts of the union. So we can see here about how these, I suppose, resentment over what the McCain's had done and their difficulties in having alienated the local community played out. So in the end, faced with, I suppose, in a sense, a union that was being a bit more savvy and local resentments and the pressures of processing large crops, what they did was they just, in a sense, were quite amenable to, I suppose, improved conditions, but also I suppose the union was involved as well. They took a ballot for industrial action, and 70% of people returned the ballots and 100% agreed with industrial action. So the union was quite buoyed by that. Management was quite sort of, I suppose, intimidated by it, and they basically folded. So we can see here what happens. They basically achieved a lot of positive things, and they've now got 100% membership and a changed managerial approach. So all these forces have interacted, and the union's made, I suppose, use of them to achieve positive outcomes for it. So at Simplot, what we have is, in a sense, a contrasting case. It again has potato processing. It's a bigger processor. It's running at capacity, and it has about 300 workers, and it's doing about 60 containers of chips every 24 hours. I mean, just I can't imagine 60 containers of chips, but anyway. And we've got vegetable processing, and that's always been more casualised and more seasonal because of the nature of the work. Vegetables are seasonal, therefore they've had a seasonal workforce, but with changes in cold storage, cool storage, that's becoming, I suppose the imperative for that is coming less and less, but the company, of course, wants to stick to casualisations because of the benefits for it. I mean, that's saying that employers like casuals because they're cheap, easy to dispose of, and they don't complain. So they take quite the union sees them as taking quite an aggressive US-led approach to the union, and they've been recruited from mining and manufacturing, traditionally quite, I suppose, aggressive sectors in Australia. So, okay, the last time, when the last the EBA but one, or a couple ago, Simplot went out quite aggressively and engaged Jackie Lambie. We all know Jackie Lambie. We would have seen her if you watch I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. She was voted out early on, and
Under a racist brand.
So she went out and basically in the press said that the Simplot workers shouldn't complain, they were well paid, and by wanting to take industrial action and going on strike, they were jeopardising jobs on the northwest coast. So she said, "I'll not stand by silently and allow selfish and reckless and unreasonable demands destroy a successful food processing industry and thousands of direct and indirect jobs." So they put an ad in the paper. The union believes that ad was paid for by Simplot. The union tried to contact her to get her to withdraw it. She didn't, but then afterwards they went and spoke to her and put forward their case, and she agreed that she would not do that again. So their relationship with the local community is poor, and again it's this thing about the local workers, and people talk about them as being out of touch with the local community. They don't live there. They've all been blow-ins, and therefore they don't know what it's like on the northwest coast, and just seen as sort of quite rapacious. So what we had in the last time is the union trying to redress what had gone on, and they were quite dispirited by the last EB. The delegate, one of the delegates said, in the last EB, he said, "We got our pants pulled down pretty bad, I thought." So he talked about the union being outplayed in the media, and they were very conscious about the kickback from the local community about them as being, well paid and greedy, basically. They ran campaigns saying this wasn't about the money, it was about respect. They went out to a ballot, but only 42% of the ballots were returned, even though they'd had a members' meeting where people had said, yes, we need to take industrial action. So they have quite a lot of difficulty in terms of advancing their agenda. The company policy prohibits members from talking in the press about the industrial disputes. So we can see here how this plays out. People feeling quite, I suppose, discouraged by the way that the community views them. I asked them whether they'd thought about engaging with the community and putting up things like posters like they'd done in Smithton. They said, "Oh, we thought about it, but we hadn't done it." They also said how they'd tried to do something where one of them had tried to donate football jumpers to a local sporting club, the kids' sporting club, and it had been knocked back because the union was seen as being political. So the union's seen as being somehow political rather than a community-based organisation. So what we see here are these sort of tensions, I suppose, coming out in that I suppose in a sense the disruption to their supply chains had caused in some ways the companies to be, I suppose, their relationships to the community and I suppose their growers to be disrupted, and in a sense Simplot had formed somewhat a contradictory, I suppose, relationship with local politicians. But even though the community wasn't probably all that enamoured by the companies, they didn't actually see the union in very positive I suppose, ways either. So what they were trying to do was to redress this by framing the way that they're seen has been about fairness rather than the wages, and trying to think about new ways, or in the terms of McCain, but perhaps Simplot was still really struggling to bring, I suppose, the debate back to a level where they could actually take control of it. And I've got the stop sign, so I'll pull up stumps there. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks, Ruth.